So I think we should get started because our keynote speaker of tonight is already waiting because we are already late in our schedule. Great. Thank you so much and welcoming to everyone who's back or who has just arrived for this year's keynote on our annual conference in ConTrust. And we are absolutely delighted that Professor Pippa Norris has agreed to give this year's keynote tonight, even though she cannot be with us in this room. It is probably not necessary and might even look a bit awkward to introduce Pippa Norris to you, but since it is a common habit to introduce speakers, I will simply comply with this habit. Now, Pippa Norris is a professor of international relations and comparative politics who has taught for 3 decades at Harvard and also in Sydney, specifically in Harvard, the Kennedy School, but also the government department and the Whitehead Center, and I think several other centers as well. I'm just highlighting these 3. She is, which I think is very impressive, at least to me, as being also a political scientist. Following Google Scholar, she is the 3rd most cited political scientist in the world. I mean, this is something of a goal that one can try to reach and probably miserably fail, but at least now I know it and I know whom I have to surpass to match that. And if that does not illustrate her importance for political science, let me also mention that she's the recipient of the Johann Skytte Award, so kind of the Nobel Prize for political science. We do not have an official one. We're trying to get the economy ones like Elinor Ostrom, but she has the Johann Skytte Award. And she's also received the Karl Deutsch Award and many others. And I can also not list all of those because there is so many of them. She also holds honorary doctorates from, and I just list them, Edinburgh, Bergen, Leuphana, and Warwick, her own alma mater. Her work covers elections and election integrity, political communication, democracy, and gender politics, also only some highlights among many other topics that she has also been doing work on. She is one of the masterminds behind the World Values Survey that many of us follow, and of the Global Party Survey measuring populism worldwide. Finally, and for contrast in this crowd here in the room of particular importance, she's also part of the TrustGov project in which she's involved alongside Will Jennings and Gary Stokert that aims to tackle the link between trust and trustworthiness, which is also important for her talk, I think, at least tonight. And these projects and many others have also given rise to an enormous amount of publications, books and articles and book chapters. And again, I will only highlight some of them, like Rising Tide, Gender Equality and Cultural Change Around the World in 2003, Radical White, or Why Elections Failed, 2015, all with Cambridge University Press, as was her latest book with a common co-author of hers, that is Ron Inglehall, on cultural backlash, Trump, Brexit, and authoritarian populism, that came out in 2019. And just very, very recently, her newest book has arrived in bookshops worldwide, that is again of particular relevance to our discussions here and will also inform the keynote tonight, that is Embrace of Skepticism, Trust but Verify, with Oxford University Press. Now, it argues that trust needs to be supplemented by trustworthiness to be reasonable. And this, I think, speaks directly to one of ConTrust's claims that trust is not by itself anything good, but that we should be able to distinguish between justified trust and forms of unjustified trust, and should understand of how they come about and how they are related to conflict as well. So I'm very excited to hear more about this argument that you are developing in the book. And with that note, dear Pippa Norris, big thank you that you are here with us tonight, and I give the floor to you and your presentation.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I apologize that I can't be away at this stage of the Harvard semester, but it's really good to be part of it, particularly because I think we do have a lot that's going to be in common. And what I need to do is to be able to share my screen, and we'll go into the presentation. So that should do the trick, and let's start. So this is something which is very much, I think, in line with the ConTrust. I hope that you can now see the screen. Is that okay? Somebody say yes if you can. Can you see the screen? Yes, perfect, thank you. So trust, and then gullibility, the opposite of trust in some ways, but certainly an issue which you need to think about, and skepticism. And the book is called In Praise of Skepticism. And I'm going to very much relate to the work of the ConTrust project and think about the role in particular of the media, the information environment, and cognitive skills. And the ConTrust project, when I looked at it online, very much emphasizes what I emphasize, which is that trust is a two-edged sword. And in our extensive amount of research that we've had in this topic, which goes back more than 7 decades, you can see that most of it has emphasized the positive aspects. But as ConTrust emphasizes, it's clear that the notion of trust and trustworthiness should not be viewed in an exclusively positive light. Rather, trust can also assume authoritarian forms, which are politically destructive and deny freedom. And I'm going to underline that and hopefully give a different normative way of understanding that, and then some empirical evidence as well to think through those claims. So first, what I'll do is talk about the theoretical framework, give you an argument and typology, then the research design, how am I going to test that? What's the ways that we can think about the arguments? The results briefly, and I'll highlight just some of them, obviously from a long book, I can't take everything, and then the conclusions and arguments. And this is the book, In Praise of Skepticism, and I use as the subtitle Reagan's phrase, which came initially from Russia, when thinking about nuclear arms and how we need to trust but verify. So what's the arguments going to be? And I start and open the book with the metaphor and analogy that we're all familiar with, is the frog and the scorpion. And this is the story of when both were on one side of the riverbank, and the scorpion and the frog wanted to get to the other side. And the scorpion said to the frog, look, let me come on your back, let me jump on, you can swim, I can't. And that way we can both get to the other side of the riverbank. And the frog says, no, why should I trust you? After all, it could be dangerous, it could be risky. And the scorpion said, but look, if I do that, if I harm you, then we'll both be harmed, not just you. And so the frog agreed, and the scorpion jumped on the back, and of course, halfway across, stung the frog, and they both started to drown. And the frog said, why? And the scorpion said, well, it's in my nature. So what that illustrates is that there can be real problems of trusting the untrustworthy. So we need to challenge the normative assumptions. That's the first claim I'm going to make about the beneficial consequences, whether it's for international peace, whether it's for civil war and conflict, whether it's for social capital, whether it's for markets, whether it's for politics, and focus not on trust, but on trustworthiness, which is a different concept. It's about a relationship. It's not just about whether I trust somebody. It's not just about inherent psychological characteristics. It's about whether or not the object of my trust is actually trustworthy. And I'm going to argue that from the point of view of authorities, for example, those who are trying to manage the COVID pandemic, those who are seeking to maintain order and law, those who are seeking to have government laws obeyed, then trust and legitimacy are always valuable because it induces compliance. It means that we go along with the authorities, whoever those are. But from the point of view of citizens, of ordinary people, it's actually more problematic and more complicated than that as well. And we need to form judgments of what is and is not trustworthy, but we often make erroneous beliefs, just like we make erroneous beliefs of other aspects of rationality. And there are two problems. One is very familiar, and that's cynicism. So think about the vaccination for COVID, and scientific evidence, peer-reviewed research says it's trustworthy, that it reduces the risks, both to individuals, to families and communities. And so in fact, we should trust it. So anti-vaxxers, for example, are not acting in their own interest nor the interest of their community. But the opposite problem, I think, is equally endemic if you go worldwide and start to think of it more broadly, and that's credulous trust. That's where people trust the untrustworthy. For example, people who trust demagogues as leaders, who make promises which they have no intention of fulfilling. Or if they think about Bernie Madoff pyramid schemes, and they put all of their investments in people advising them financially, but in fact, they lose all their money and life savings. Or if they trust, for example, those who claim that all sorts of quack medicines are going to benefit you if you have COVID, but in fact, you won't. So we need accurate evaluations. We need judgments about what is and is not justified to be trustworthy. And here I'm going to argue two factors are really important. Many others may be important as well, but two I'm going to demonstrate. One is individual cognitive skills. So the more information I have, for example, about science and medicine, or about government and how it works, or about another country, if I'm thinking about trusting an ally on the international stage, then the more my knowledge is going to be beneficial to having accurate judgments of trustworthiness. But the other thing which is critical, worldwide in particular, is the information environment. So I could be well educated, I could be very much knowledgeable, but if society has limits in terms of censorship from the government, if there's state ownership of the media, if there's not a plural environment where freedom of expression is allowed, if there's only one view being transmitted versus two, if I live in a media bubble, then I've got problems as well, because I won't be able to judge the accuracy of the information. And what we need to do is not build trust, but build trustworthiness in the authorities, particularly in government. And I'm going to argue that there are three aspects of this. One is competency. In other words, how far people have the skills and the ability to deliver on their promises. For example, are surgeons going to be effective if they're operating on a heart patient? Is COVID medicine going to be able to reduce incidence and reduce the illness? Are governments and parties going to be able to promise certain things that they're going to deliver and actually do that when they come to power? And then integrity is important. That's about transparency and honesty and impartiality, acting on behalf of the client, not on behalf of the agent. And to do that, you need effective institutional guardrails, not just trustworthy individuals. For example, media has to be free and open, and there have to be watchdog agencies to make sure that government is performing and is not corrupt, it's not self-interested. The next step in this research, I'll just mention at the end, is about authoritarian regimes and whether there can be genuine legitimacy, and that's my most recent research, and I'll just touch on that at the end if we have time. So the book itself, I'll cover a little bit from the opening chapters, which are about the theory, a bit about the evidence I'm going to use, and then I'll touch briefly on some of the results to confirm some of the arguments I'm making and some of the claims. So just like ConTrust, trust is multidimensional and multidisciplinary. And so clearly we can think about trust in global governance, for example, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and trust in other nations, in peace processes, for example, when we come to alliances. Can we trust other NATO partners? For example, if one is attacked, is everybody else going to come to their defense, as in Poland? And that's the field of international relations, but also cultural sociology, comparative politics. Then we have trust within the nation state, and particularly an enormous amount of research on trust in national governments and its agencies, for example, in terms of parties or in terms of parliaments, and in civil society, such as trust in the media. And that's the field very much of political behavior and comparative politics. And then we also have at individual or interpersonal level, the trust that we have with our neighbours, with our friends, with our collaborators, and that's sociology and social psychology, behavioural economics, looking at trust games, and organisational studies, looking at trust within large-scale management, for example, between employees and those who are in charge of the organisation. And the conventional view, as I'm sure everybody in the room is very familiar with from the classic work that's just been done, is that trust has positive consequences, it's a public good. So, for example, my colleague Bob Putnam argues that it facilitates societal cooperation. If the state doesn't work, but people can still work on local problems, for example, parent-teacher associations, then you can get things improved in your local area. And those who argue that it's about relationships, it may help to sustain marriage or love. Francis Fukuyama, it can lubricate markets. Again, if contracts fail in the courts, but you can trust relationships on trade, or consumers can trust products, that helps in the free market. Managing organizations, Gabriel Armand, of course, in the civic culture, how it can strengthen political legitimacy if you trust your government and you will voluntarily go along with the rule of law and the courts and the police. And in particular nowadays in issues of the US Congress, given intense partisan polarization and gridlock, which is likely, by the way, to be exacerbated by the current elections, where one house holds the House, the other holds the Senate, then Hetherington and Rudolph argues trust can help to overcome polarization. It allows parties to bargain with each other. Russet, it facilitates international peace amongst democracies, because if you can trust other countries, you can work together, whether it's about trade cooperation or whether it's about other forms of peace processes or security. And it can reduce conflict and facilitate solidarity and cooperation. And that is obviously the heart of what's being examined in the ConTrust project. If so, of course, any signs of either low or declining trust should be a matter of concern, and we should all be worried about that. But let's think a little harder about this. And again, when we think about some current developments which are going on, whether we're thinking, for example, about trust in America, in QAnon and conspiracy theories, and the conspiracy theories about the big lie that was so endemic that we had over 300 electoral deniers standing for office in the Republican Party. Or we have trust in other conspiracies, the Pizzagate conspiracy, for example, about pedophilia and rings of Democrats, which was, of course, utterly fallacious. Or trust in Invectamin, horse medicine. Or, of course, the events which ultimately led to January the 6th, which was a deadly riot, which undermined faith in American democracy. And, of course, the consequences continue to play out as we go through politics. And, of course, yesterday, as Trump said that he was going to stand again, it's not going to go away in 2024. So all of these add complications. And let's think, therefore, harder about the actual drivers of trust and how we conceptualize that. So there are three, I think, schools of thought, and they come from different disciplines. On the one hand, from social psychology and psychology, trust is seen as inherited. It's a characteristic rather like if you're an optimist or a pessimist, if you're an extrovert or you're an introvert. It's one of those big 5 personality traits. And as Ulsana argues in his book, you're therefore either born with it or not. And it should be fairly stable. It shouldn't change that much in an individual lifetime or in society. And therefore, what you need to do is not so much think about changing trust, but thinking about the consequences of trust. A second view, which is related but different, is clearly there in terms of political sociology. And that's very much exemplified by the work of my late collaborator, Ron Inglehart. And in this view, it's societal rather than individual. If you're born in Sweden, or you're born in Peru, if you're born in Russia, or you're born in Germany, you're likely to learn different aspects and different orientations towards trust. So it's a cultural attitude and belief acquired in early childhood from all of those media agencies in terms of things like schools, neighbors, friends, colleagues, the family, the parents. And once you acquire that orientation, it's unlikely to change within each society. And even if individuals move, for example, studies have looked at Swedes who've moved to living in studies in Latin America, and they found they carry their trust with them, even in societies which are highly insecure, with high levels of crime or other problems. The third view, however, which is derived much more from rational choice theories, is the one which I use in the book. And in this is a performance theory. And it says that trustworthiness is a relationship. It's not about whether you trust or whether I trust. It's an informal social contract, which can be obviously depicted in terms of the principal-agent relationships. So principals, for example, citizens in terms of government, patients in terms of doctors, clients in terms of lawyers, the principals authorize the agent act on their behalf, the expectation that the agent will fulfill their responsibilities in future with the qualities of competency. They have the skills, they have the ability to deliver, they have the resources, integrity, they're honest and they're actively open, and impartiality. They'll act on your behalf, not on their behalf, despite conditions of high risk and high uncertainty. And the higher the risk, the more that we make these judgments, and we base it on their past performance. But of course, nobody knows whether or not performance from the past is going to be replicated in future. So, for example, do you trust a political party? Well, you might look at their competency. For example, have they delivered peace and prosperity? What's their record on reducing inflation or improving jobs? Are they honest, or have they had financial scandals? Have they had issues of corruption, which have been noted? And are they impartial, or are they basically politicians just out to seek power, making all sorts of promises, but with no real sense that they're going to benefit the public good, or their supporters when they come to power? So we try to project into the future based on past, but we have no guarantees that there's going to continue to be based on that past performance. All sorts of things can change. The leader, the promises, the conditions in the country, events, etc. Now, if we do that, then the typology that we have can be depicted as a nice, simple 2x2. So we have trust by principles, is it positive or negative? And then we have agency performance, is it negative or positive? And when you do that, what you can end up is relationships where the principles, for example, citizens feel trust. For example, if you're in Sweden and you go to a housing department and hope that you're going to be treated fairly and that they're going to give you the benefits you're entitled to, but you gather some information about that, that's skeptical trust. And skeptical means it's not automatic. It's not that you trust just because of the past loyalties or you learn to trust. Instead, you gather some information. By contrast, there's another normatively desirable quality, which is skeptical mistrust. And that's if the agency is negative in its performance. For example, if you go to a housing association and they're in fact very corrupt and they won't give benefits on an impartial basis, then you should be skeptical. For example, think about the government of Haiti, which has been decimated both by natural disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes, but also by coups d'etats and therefore assassinations of their president, where there's high levels of instability. They have very few resources. They can't deliver poverty alleviation or stability for their citizens. And naturally, in that case, you should be skeptically mistrusting of any promises which are being made. So it's not necessarily problematic from the point of view of the principle. Now, what about the other aspects? And these are the two which are the ones which are more problematic, which are cynicism, where in fact the agency is going to deliver, but you don't believe them. So those, for example, in the Republican Party, who say they're going to impeach Anthony Fauci, who's had a sterling record on delivering throughout his lifetime on public health, that's cynical mistrust of authorities who are going to be beneficial. And then you can also get credulous trust. And that's the issue which I think has been very much underestimated, where the performance by the principle is positive. Sorry, the performance is negative, but people are trusting. And you don't have to go very far. You can think about those who believe in the big lie, that the election in 2020 was illegitimate. And when you look at the figures, what you can find quite quickly in any public opinion poll is that 70% of Republicans continue to say that Biden has not been elected through legitimate means, that the election was fraudulent. And so they're credulous. They believe the claims which are being made by election deniers in Congress, by the media, such as Fox News, and by many other sources of those that they look on the dark web, who say that the election was rigged or cannot be trusted. So credulous trust, I argue, is as much of a problem, particularly when we get to media bubbles and particularly in closed societies. In those, you don't get accurate information, you get state propaganda. And another clear example, in Russia, when Putin invaded Ukraine in February, he made the claim that he was doing it to stamp out Nazis in the country. And that the claim was one where the Russian army was going in as a, quote, special military operation in order to save those in Ukraine who were otherwise being in far-right groups. And so credulous trust is widespread, and particularly in closed societies like Russia. And after that claim was being made, Russia's popularity went up 20 points. And it's stayed up there in March, in April, in May, right through in terms of people in particular watching state television in Russia. So what we can do is think about a model we're trying to assess empirically judgments of trustworthiness, whether it's social, state or international. We need indicators of performance empirically, macro level, and those we can get from a variety of sources, whether it's official statistics, whether it's international data, or whether it's things like expert judgments. And obviously it never is direct, so the intermediate is the public perceptions. And the public may or may not have accurate perceptions based on the information they have. And if they have accurate perceptions, then they make more accurate judgments of trustworthiness. That's the assumption. And the intermediate conditions are the individual level, things like knowledge and education, and then the societal level, open and closed societies, media pluralism, and so on, both of which shape public perceptions and the accuracy and rationality of public perceptions. And then there's a feedback loop, because clearly judgments of trustworthiness can affect performance. For example, if you trust the courts and the law enforcement agencies, you're more likely to have more effective rule of law. So what's the research design? How do we test this empirically and these broad claims? So I'm using the World Values Survey and the European Values Survey, and I'm focusing on the 7th wave, which is the most recent one, which is actually just going to bed now. We've just had a few late surveys coming in, but we've had surveys, of course, from the WVS from 1981 to 2021. We're just celebrating our 40th anniversary. It covers 115 diverse open and closed societies, and it has from the very beginning included measures of interpersonal trust, institutional confidence, a large battery, and then trust in global governance has been included in the most recent wave. And the TrustGov project, of which I'm a part, funded by the ESRC, has helped to fund WVS surveys and added 13 diverse closed societies and authoritarian countries, as well as some new questions. And these countries are very varied. They're governed by a variety of different types of regime, for example, in Iran, with a theocracy under the Ayatollah, in terms of personal dictatorships, in terms of military juntas, such as in Myanmar, after the country closed down again, and Aung San Suu Kyi was put back into prison, Nicaragua, with a predominant party, the Philippines, Tajikistan, Venezuela, Vietnam, and so on. So these are the coverage in the World Values Survey, and this is the cumulative waves across 7 different surveys, and pretty good in Latin America, in Europe, Central Eastern Asia, not so good in Africa, unfortunately, but we're expanding where we get resources to try and cover as many countries as possible. We're just starting to plan the 8th wave right now. This is what the societies look like when I compare those which are by levels of liberal democracy and by levels of freedom of expression. And so I'm using here the aggregate data from the Varieties of Democracy project, an excellent resource at the University of Gothenburg. And I'm classifying the countries in the World Values Survey, the European Values Survey, based on their characteristics. The countries which are highlighted in green are the ones which are high in liberal democracy and also in freedom of expression, which includes media pluralism and rights to dissent. And that's obviously countries like Germany, but also Denmark, the Netherlands, France, but also some newer democracies like Slovakia, South Korea, Tunisia, Peru, and so on. And then at the bottom, we have countries in red, which are highlighted as authoritarian regimes with repressive governments. For example, President Xi has just expanded his powers in the most recent Congress and is likely to be there for a lifetime. But also a Belarus under Lukashenko, Russia under Putin, Iran under the Ayatollah, and some others which are slightly freer, but nevertheless have problems such as Pakistan, Iraq, and so on. So I'm going to be able to compare lots of different countries and different types of open and closed societies. Now, what we need to do is also think about our measures of trust. These are the ones which are included in the World Values Survey. And I'm not going to cover all of these and discuss all of these, but this is the factor analysis. And obviously we have the countries which are about global governance and trust, for example, in the UN. Trusting national government, which I will focus on, which form a nice scale, parliaments, the government, parties, the civil service, and then trust in social movements, the media, out-group trust, in-group trust, which are very useful for social trust studies. And those are available for secondary analysis. The data is available at worldvaluesurvey.org. And what I need to do for my methods are very straightforward. It's not a very complicated approach. First, I need to measure the levels of public trust in diverse agents and societies. Then I need to be able to compare that against both subjective, but ideally objective measures of agency performance. And then the simple test, more accurate judgments, are those where there's a strong correlation between the two. And so one assumes that the objective indicators give us a good guide to actual performance, and we can therefore test it. So let's look at some results, and then we can open it up for questions and answers and highlight the conclusions. Here's some of the evidence. So what we've got are two categories of society, and I've got open societies and closed based on the classification you just saw. I've got about 25 to 43 open societies when I compare from the 7th wave of the World Value Survey with about 30,000 respondents, and about the same number of closed societies, and again, the same number of respondents. What I'm doing is to be able to compare the mean trust in government scale, standardized, which is about trust in government, parties, parliament, and the civil service for each society, by aggregate indicators from the World Bank, the World Development Indicators, which are lagged before the survey was conducted. And our standard indicators of development, things like economic growth, development, unemployment rates, inflation, equality economically, and then some social indicators as well. What does it show? And let's emphasize that these are not multivariate, these are simple correlations, because obviously there's a problem of multicollinearity. If one was to try to put in, for example, some of these as a more multivariate model. So in open societies, to highlight the results, they basically are moderate to strong correlations. They point in the expected direction, and they're largely significant. Not everyone, but most of them. So economic growth, the higher the level of improvements in GDP per capita, then the more people trust their government. The higher the level of economic development, GDP per capita in purchasing power parity, greatly it predicts how far in that society there's high levels of trust in their government. By contrast, in unemployment rates, the higher the level of unemployment, the worse the trust. Inflation doesn't prove to be significant. I think that's largely because at the time of this survey, inflation wasn't a major problem, although I should imagine that in wave 8, when we repeat this, we'll find that it actually comes out pretty strong and significant now, since everybody's facing rising prices. When it comes to equality and economic equality measured by the income share of the highest and lowest 20%, exactly what you would expect. The more inequality, the less you trust government. The more equality, the more you trust them. And it's not just economics. Look at secondary school education, strong and significant. Look at the homicide rate, which is a great measure of security in your community, negative and it's very strong. Longevity, not so significant, but pointing in the right direction. And maternal mortality doesn't prove to be significantly related. Not every indicator can be pointing in the right direction as predicted, but the balance of them are. And what about closed societies? Well, look at that contrast. Across closed societies, almost none have any significant relationship between trust and performance. The only one which is there is unemployment, pointing in the right direction as expected. Everything else, sometimes it's the wrong direction, but in every case, it's statistically insignificant. And you can see, for example, that the relationships are sometimes not what you would expect. So secondary education, the more people have completed secondary education, the less they trust their government. So performance is not predicting trust. Let's have a look at this. Let's unpack this a bit. Let's see what's going on. And it becomes clearer. And this is data visualization. Across the bottom, trust in government, the index from the World Value Survey, which is from low to high. And then on the vertical index, per capita GDP. So the green line summarizes the open societies. And the highest level of trust in many places are those in Scandinavia. So Norway, Denmark, and Sweden always comes out tops. No matter what you do in every survey, it always comes out high. So does Switzerland, one of the most affluent countries, and the Netherlands, and also Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all the established liberal democracies come out high. But if you look at some countries which have an open society, but with lower performance, then there's lower trust in Mexico, in Peru, in Brazil, in Tunisia, in Guatemala, in Bulgaria, in Slovenia. So it's post-communist and Latin American and some countries in the Middle East as well. They come from different regions, but essentially where there's lower per capita GDP, there's lower trust in their government. The United States, which I've highlighted, comes out as more affluent than the actual levels of trust. And that, I think, is residual. It's about the path dependency. America has never trusted government as much as many more liberal and egalitarian societies. And again, there are some other outliers. But as we can see, there's a line that is significantly correlated. What about the countries which have got a closed information environment? They're highlighted in red. And you can see that China comes out with much higher trust in the government, according to the survey, than in Norway, than in Switzerland, than in Denmark and in Sweden. And it's not alone. So does one-party Vietnam. So does the Philippines under Duterte. So does Myanmar under a military junta, even though it's one of the poorest societies. Bangladesh, which is riven by conflict, Azerbaijan, Indonesia, Thailand, Iran, currently with people on the street demonstrating high levels of conflict in society. Pakistan also with problems over Imran Khan. Ethiopia with a civil war and problems of on its border as well. So levels of trust in government can be high despite low levels of GDP and low levels of growth in economics. And again, there are some outliers there. Singapore is always an outlier. Hong Kong, I think in Hong Kong, it's explained by the fact that trust is a residual pattern because of the government that did work effectively prior to the clampdown and the more repressive regime when China has exerted its control on the media, shutting down independent media, but also shutting down independent voices of dissent very strongly. And again, we can see the line is flat. So we have some countries with similar levels of income to China and Vietnam, but with much lower trust in government if they are living in a country which is in a closed environment. Now, what about other measures? Maybe those measures aren't the right ones. Maybe people aren't judging policy outcomes or policy performance. Maybe they're judging how the process worked. So we can compare, again, simple correlations by type of society for measures of good governance. And here I'm using the World Bank measures, which are widely available: control of corruption, government effectiveness, stability, rule of law, etc. And I've added in levels of liberal democracy from the Variety of Democracy project. In the open societies, what you can see is that there's a strong and consistent relationship, which is highly significant in the correlations between all of the measures of the quality of governance, how it works, and trust in their government. The more there's control of corruption, the more you trust your government. And look at liberal democracy. It's weaker, but it's also significant. And that's covering 43 societies at aggregate level. But in closed societies, most of these are not significant. So it's not about the quality of how there's a rule of law or political stability, which creates trust in the government in closed societies. And if you look at the measures of democracy, what you'll find is they're negative, and strongly negative, not positive. Let's have a look at what that looks like in a data visualization. And here again, we can put in the typology that I explained earlier. So you've got trust in government going along the bottom, the horizontal axis, and good governance going across the vertical axis. And if we look at the open societies in green, there's a strong relationship, and it's stronger than those policy performance measures that we compared earlier. And so again, you can see the Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland come out high. And we can see that cases where the governance is much worse, Guatemala, for example, highly unstable, high levels of corruption, problems of rule of law, violence by gangs. And we can see that it comes out problematic, and trust is lower. So as it is in Ukraine, which was prior to the conflict and the invasion by Russia, Ecuador, Tunisia, which of course has just had the president reassert his power over the fledgling moves towards having a more open democracy, Peru, Romania, Argentina, and so on. But in the cases of the closed societies, what we can see is that there's either a flat relationship or a negative relationship between the quality of government and trust in that government. And it's even stronger. Look at this. This is remarkable. This is the level of liberal democracy using the variety of democracy measure, which is now standard, and then trust in your government. The more opportunities there are for accountability and participation, the more effective liberal institutions work, then the more you trust your government in open societies. Now, as you can see, some open societies are cynical, and that's because in those countries, liberal democracy is less effective in its performance. And in contrast, look at that line for the closed societies, and many of those countries which express high trust in their government express it, I'd argue, because of credulity. In other words, they believe their messages because they get one-sided information rather than two-sided. Opposition parties are silenced. Dissidents are imprisoned or exiled. The media is shut down, so only state television is available. VPNs have to be used. Think about Iran and the way that the protesters are trying to get their message out and trying to use the internet to coordinate. They can't use the internet, which is censored. And we find other forms of freedom of expression are censored. For example, in Turkey, academic freedom is limited. Civil service and the public sector is restricted if they're critical of the government. And so essentially, what we can see is that in countries with two-sided information, where some of it's critical, but some of it's positive, you're more likely to be able to trust the government. If you only have one-sided information, then you're more likely to trust the government, but to trust it not based on its performance, not based on actually how it works. And again, we get those who are skeptical mistrusters, for example, in Nicaragua or in Lebanon, where the government has had all sorts of problems of delivering and of functioning effectively. Bosnia-Herzegovina, where conflict is frozen. Mexico, where there's high levels of violence, especially against the drug cartels. Iraq, where there's divided government. Brazil, where, of course, Bolsonaro, until recently, was the president. Poland, where authoritarian populists, the Law and Justice Party, have been in power, and so on and so forth. So what's the conclusions? And open it up for Q&A. Well, what the arguments are exactly the ones that have been presented at the opening, that trust per se is actually problematic. If I trust those who are untrustworthy. And after all, when we talk to children and we teach them how to be safe, we say, don't trust strangers offering you sweets. Don't trust those who are offering you benefits, but are not accountable, where you have no information to judge their trustworthiness. And of course, compliance is valuable. And so governments and other authorities want people to go along with their view, want people to comply, to obey the law. But it's also a mechanism to maintain control in authoritarian regimes. And erroneous beliefs are common, just like you make the wrong beliefs about any other rational decision. And they involve both cynicism and credulity. For example, you might well believe, because you've grown up, to think you can trust the police. But as we know from the Black Lives Matter movement in America, there can be problems of police behavior, especially racism and endemic problems in how far the police are actually held to account when they do behave in ways which don't serve their local community. More information, ipso facto, is better, but above all, more plural information, more information which is offering you alternative views, And that is the basis of skepticism. It's not loyalty, it's not automatic, it's instead saying, I've got to find out about this. I don't know the results, I don't know the conclusions I should make, so I need to do my homework. I need to find out and gather as much information as I can, especially in high-risk post-conflict environments. We need to build government trustworthiness, but we need above all to build effective institutional guardrails to make sure that governments are open, to make sure that those in authority can be held to account if they don't behave in ways which are appropriate, and to make sure that we have watchdogs and skeptical information available to citizens. And I'll just end on that with the idea that after all, the 2022 election in the midterms we've just had, everybody was so worried going into the election about problems of potential violence at the polls because of their beliefs in the conspiracy and that elections in America are rigged or fraudulent. Fortunately, there was no substantive cases of violence. And those who were defeated accepted it. They accepted it and stood down, even though they may question the results of the 2020 election. And part of that, I think, was very much the role of the media in emphasizing that it takes time to have a count and that essentially election deniers were a high risk to democracy. As Biden said, democracy was on the ballot. And the American public, far from being fools and far from being stupid, accepted that, and sufficient mainstream Republicans voted along with independents, along with Democrats, to make sure that most electoral deniers who were standing to actually run elections in future contests as secretaries of state in local states, they were defeated. Some election deniers were still elected to Congress, of course, because Republican loyalties are still strong, and because they often live in and work in states and in seats which are highly gerrymandered. Nevertheless, the real risk that everybody thought was there has reduced. The clock, rather like the nuclear clock, was basically at 5 minutes to midnight, and everybody now believes that at least the risks have gone back somewhat, although they haven't gone away, because again, we have President Trump, the former President Trump, running for office, and his acolytes who do believe very strongly that you can believe the word of a person who's a demagogue. So it's not just closed societies, but if you only listen to Fox News in the past, or you only look at the dark web, or if you only listen to the MAGA movement, then you come to erroneous conclusions. And the next step in my research is to compare authoritarian legitimacy and why it is and whether we have had risks to the soft democratic norms. So thank you all very much. I hope that that was helpful and that we can think about some of these issues. And I look forward to Q&A. And by the way, there are big questions, of course, about the data. Is it the case that we can trust the evidence when people in Russia and China and so on say that they trust government? We did actually include some listed experiments to try to monitor that. But nevertheless, these are the conclusions that we found. And just the last point, the evidence which I present today and in the book is focused on trusting government. But of course, you can apply this to any other agent. And so anybody can use the same method, the same normative assumptions, and apply it to performance for example, international bodies, or trust in international alliances, or trust in local agencies, or trust in individuals and in society as a whole. So thank you very much. I hope that that worked for you. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments and ideas as well.